I hope you had a good fall break. This is PowerPoint 17, I believe, on how to write your final functional behavioral assessment and behavioral support plan and the format that needs to take place. Now, if you go back and you look at all of the videos I've done, one of them in particular has step by step, the different sections that need to be included in your functional behavioral assessment and your behavioral support plan write-up. Be sure you follow those. I'm going to be using that as my plan for grading your papers, and so be sure that you're following those different formats. This goes into a little more detail. The thing that I noticed in trying to prepare for this class in general is that there's not one specific place that you can go to where you find a format for a functional behavioral assessment and a behavioral support plan. And so believe me when I say the work that went into putting all the different sections down that came from your textbook, as well as sections that I saw in on the internet that are used in different school districts and what have you, and I combined those for you. I tried to save you a whole lot of your own personal research. So if you follow the format, there shouldn't be anything that's missing that they would expect from you. So if for instance you were working at a facility that has to do with the state of Texas or what have you, and they came in and did their quarterly checks on your records, then what I have included in your assessment and your formatting here will fit most of those requirements. And so please keep a copy of it, keep it in your notes for later after graduation so that you have some foundation to turn back to. Okay, so let's start off with the 5 steps for collecting your functional behavioral assessment data. Now we've already been through a lot of this, but I just want to reiterate to you that in your paper there should be 5 sections that go along with with section 1, which is the functional behavioral assessment. So the very first part is your baseline measurements that define the observed behavior. You're actually conducting a functional behavioral assessment, meaning that you've decided, what kind of things that you're going to do to precipitate the behavior, and you're going to decide whether or not these are problems by doing number 3, which is performing a discrepancy analysis. What the discrepancy analysis has to do with is looking at, is the behavior due to one of those contingencies that could be easily remedied without doing a formal behavioral plan. In other words, this is where you look for a discrepancy between what a child can do and what the expectations are. Number 4 is you need to have a record of any previous treatment that the child or the family has been through. And number 5, you need to show that you've reviewed those health and medical records by summarizing what you were able to find out as a result of them. So then the second part of your paper is behavioral interventions, and we'll go into that later. The baseline measurement is the very first part has to do with talking to everybody about the problem. So in your paragraph, your first paragraph, you're defining who is the identified patient, who are the people that you've talked to, how is this behavior impacting everyone, and who are the key figures that you need to be getting your observations and theories from. Is very important to have that in your first section of your FBA. So this is your who, what, when, where, and how, your frequency, the duration, the intensity of the behavior, the concrete description of the behavior, that's the topography based on what the family and caregivers describe. Be sure that you identify who says what. So if mom says that the behavior is a child is, quote, disrespectful to her father, Okay, and then the father says that the problem is that there is a lot of yelling and screaming that goes on as a result of putting on clothing in the morning. Okay, which one is the problem? Is it the yelling and the screaming, or is it disrespect? And how do you define disrespect in this particular family? So who's involved with behavior is real important. Socially mediated behaviors, we're already trying to rule that out. And then when you're describing the behavior in your own paper, as well as any other paper you turn in, if there has been a diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis, that's okay to include that in there, but be sure that you put it in either quotes or if you say Mrs. Jones states in quotes that Johnny was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder at the age of 8. Something like that, or any professional jargon that might go into it that has to do with diagnosis or some kind of a medical condition. It's okay to state those in the paper, but remember that a parent has a right to read every single thing that you've written, so you want to be sure that most of it is done in very concrete terms and using the same language that the parents used rather than coming up with your own language, and being sure that you put in quotes the language that somebody else has said, especially if it's unprofessional language, so that it's not attributed to your own assessment of the behavior. So we want to look at, when did the behavior start? When does it usually stop? When was the last time it happened? When does it occur? When did it become a problem? And where does it occur? So the people, places, and things are very important here. How would you describe the problem from before it was a problem to after it's a problem? So what that really gets about is asking someone, describe for me, what is happening now, and how would you know if this problem had gone away? What would your life look like if you didn't have this problem going on? And so what we're basically detailing is the pinpoint behavior, and that is covered up by my video picture. So behavioral interviewing, we're going to go through this again. The incident method is usually the best thing that Senpani recommends, which is basically having the parents or the caregivers give you an incident. Describe for me one time in which this behavior was a problem and walk me through it from the very beginning to the end, and then ask more details about that incident. What were the antecedents? And don't use that word, but you want to know what happened before the screaming took place. What happened before your child had a meltdown, as you call it? And what does a meltdown really look like when you're telling me using that terminology? So if you look on page 311 and 313 through 313 in your functional behavioral assessment book, he actually gives you questions that help you rule out whether they're escape or access problems. And then you're also wanting to find out, of course, through your positive reinforcement questions, how much of this is access behavior? How does the environment change as a result of the behavior? What does everybody do after the child has done this behavior? Why does the child use this behavior to get what they want instead of something else? And what has this child tried to do that didn't work? And does this behavior actually produce more than one reinforcement? In other words, does it produce not only getting what they want, but is there some sort of socially mediated access that they get at the same time? And then the negative reinforcement questions have to do with escape behavior. In other words, how does this behavior get them away from what they're trying to escape, and what is it that they are trying to escape? The maintaining contingency, again, is the reinforcers. What is happening that allows them to get what they want or allows them to run away from it? And can you tell, just based on this behavioral interviewing, whether you have a socially mediated or a direct access, direct consequences? Other direct observations have to do with understanding the frequency and occurrence of the behavior. How many times does the behavior happen in a 30 to 60 minute time period? And this is, if you have something that frequently occurring, you can use your time sampling or your scatter plots, whatever's going to work, whether you want to use just slash marks to delineate every time something happens, that's fine, but your direct observation has to do with looking for behaviors that are pretty frequent to where you can just observe, right? So frequency, behavior, percentages have to do with a target behavior that where a child's given a certain number of things to do and what's the percentage of times they get it correct. So it might have more to do with an academic issue in which a child's presented, for instance, word problems over and over again, and that seems to be where the problems happen and where the percentage of correct responses is very low. A trigger analysis, we've talked about that also. This is when a behavior is hard to happen. Maybe it happens only once a week, but when it does happen, it is of such intensity that it's causing problems for this child. Well, how are we going to trigger that behavior to happen in front of us so we can see the frequency, duration, and understand what's happened? So sometimes the trigger analysis is something that we know is going to happen. You know, if mother only goes to the grocery store every other week, then we may ask her to actually go and recreate the situation. Nowadays with people's video cameras and on their phones, sometimes we can even ask someone to go along and just discreetly kind of videotape what's happening when that child's out of control. Another thing that we use is what we call pre-session exposure, and this is when you have a child or an adult that really you don't know whether they can do what you're wanting them to do. And so what you do for precipitating or triggering this is you actually show the child something very, very enticing that they're going to get if they can perform for you what you're asking them to perform. So for instance, you might have, a huge jar of M&Ms, and you say to them, okay, if you can show me that you can do 15 math problems without getting out of your chair and staying focused, then you're going to get this whole jar to take home with you. All right, that's pretty enticing to some children, especially a child that loves sweets, right? But on the other hand, it might be something more related to you're going to get to play the video game and completely miss English class. If you're able to show me that you can do this, then I will give you a whole hour in which you can play video games instead of going to class. It has to be a very enticing thing, and this is only when you are not sure a child can do something, but you suspect they can, and you're trying to force the issue and get it out in the open whether they're capable or not. Then after you've done all this observation and you've looked at it, you're pulling together your ABC analysis. And based on the measures and observations and analysis of the situation, you're trying to decide, what triggers are happening. What are the antecedents before the behavior? Are they at home or are they at school? What's the environment? A lot of kids, not a lot of kids. Remember the sensory versus behavior chart that I showed you, in which the more activity, noise, the lack of structure and whatever can be big precipitators to behavioral problems. So are you looking at the environmental factors? Are you looking at sensory factors? Or are you looking at curriculum or expectations where there's a skill set deficit before anything even starts? These are your antecedents that you're trying to avoid happening. And then and along with the antecedents has to do with the establishing operations. What are the events and all of that alters the consequences of their behavior? In other words, are they more likely to do the positive behaviors when they come into class and they're more motivated, like before lunch? So if you're using edibles as your consequence, as your reinforcer, and you find that anything after lunchtime it's just not working, okay, then your antecedent is the problem. You are using food as your reinforcer, and you've assessed your antecedent has already been satisfied. So your establishing operation isn't there, or you are waiting for you're trying to precipitate an aggravating situation in order for a child to escape, and you don't make that aggravation hard enough or rough enough or clear enough to them. So, for example, if a child gets very irritated and seems to be unhappy when the classroom is very cold. Okay, well, how cold does it have to be in order for that child to start getting really grumpy and trying to find reasons to leave the classroom? And does it just so happen that mom has caught on to this, and now child is coming to school with a really thick comfy coat or comfy sweater, and so all of a sudden your antecedent that was the problem that making them uncomfortable, they've taken care of it on their own by just a simple intervention with the antecedent and the variables. So we want to look at what are the establishing operations and what are the ongoing motivating operations that keep these things happening. All right, so another example of this is just showing your antecedents. When you have an athlete who's running 10 miles, then the establishing operation is thirst, in this case, in looking for water. And so water is going to be an effective reinforcer. However, if an athlete has water with them, they're ongoing, like maybe they have a bladder that they carry on their back, like you would do in backpacking, and they're drinking along the way, then they're not thirsty by the time the water is offered. And so all of a sudden you no longer have an establishing operation that encourages them to want to stop at that station to get the water if you're on a competitive run, for instance. So back again, establishing operation is deprivation for and access behaviors, and it is the presence of something that's irritating for your escape behaviors. Your motivating operations is what increases behavior. Your abolishing operations decrease the behavior. And in your paper, please address this. I guess it's the most important part. Look at your antecedents and be sure that you identify them as establishing operations or motivating operations. Sometimes you'll have a conditioned motivating operation, and this has to do with learning that comes as a result of neutral events. And so it's like that paired stuff. It's like Pavlov's dog business with the drooling that comes when they hear the bell that means that the food is going to be presented. So definitely unconditioned motivating operations are things that are based on biological conditions and our survival. So anything that has to do with pain, hunger, thirst, sleep, oxygen, temperature, boredom, and even sex can be things that are very unconditioned and are very primitive in terms of needs and wants. And so those are things that someone doesn't have to shape and should be a natural part of someone's establishing operation. Now, I want to do a caveat to that, meaning that some very unusual problems, physical and medical problems, can create a whole different thing. Maybe someone that does not feel pain, for instance, or maybe they are in latter stages of dementia or something, and so they have quit drinking water. They're not interested in water. They're not hungry anymore. They are wandering at night. They don't seem to have a need for sleep. Or even think about a person with manic depression where there's a brain dysfunction that changes their sensitivity. Temperature, for instance, going back to that sensory issue, can affect the differences here too. So let's also look at discriminative stimuli, and these are just signals that tell you whether something is available or unavailable. And a couple of the examples I want to give to you is a school bell at around noon. Those two things paired together typically mean lunch is served, right? And after years and years and years of kids going to school and being able to read a clock and hearing that bell, then that, the bell that goes off means we're going to go to lunch, and we've got hunger going on here. And so if the bell goes off and it's noon and then nobody gets to go to lunch, there's going to be problems. You're going to see things happening based on that DS that everybody's expecting. The same thing goes with if anybody owns a cat and the cat is used to having the wet, canned food, and they'll get used to the sound of the can opener, the rrrr, and they'll come running whenever any can is opened, whether it's green beans for your own, your own use, or whatever. The cat comes meowing. That's an example of a discriminative stimuli. All right, so now we did our A, the antecedents. Now we're going into B, which is behavior, and this is when we're trying to look at what is the function of the behavior. So we're going to describe their obtaining behavior, their attention to or other events of activities and toys, or we're describing their escape behavior, their demands, the undesired events that they are trying to avoid, the sensory consequences, trying to relieve pain or something, feeling good. So in your behavioral analysis, your ABC, the function starts to come in play right now, this at the B part. So be sure that you're not only describing the behavior, but you're describing which function. Now here's some psychological obtain and avoidance things that have been addressed in other books, and I wanted to cover those because you might hear that people talk about these from a psychological standpoint. Be understanding that they are still based on functional work. So power and control is an obtain, but is it a socially mediated access, right, or of some sort, right? Or is this actually an escape type of thing? And does it have, usually power and control is obtained, but does it really involve people? I don't know. Protection and escape is an avoidance kind of thing. So trying to keep from getting hurt. Acceptance and affiliation is usually an obtaining behavior, wanting to be part of a crowd, wanting to be part of a family. Expression of self can either be avoidance or obtaining something, and gratification can either be an avoidance or obtaining. Justice or revenge is usually obtaining. Now, obtaining what? The what is the thing. So you can say justice, somebody's obtaining justice, but how does that actually get formulated? So let me give you an example. So I have worked with this person who has a theme in their life where somehow they feel it is their job to handle every misconduct that happens in front of them that they witness. And recently what happened is somebody butted in line at a fast food restaurant. And so this person decided to take it upon themselves to confront the person who butted in line. And so they were trying to obtain justice for everyone in line. It wasn't necessary. Nobody else asked them to do it. They felt it was their job to obtain it. Okay, so how did they obtain it? They started yelling obscenities at the person who butted in line and would not let it go, kept on, calling them like really childish names. You're a line buster, you're an idiot. Nobody likes somebody who skips into line, and this kept on, and it provoked then a fight. And so then the guy who was in line had butted in line, decides to get into a physical altercation with the person who feels that they've got to obtain this justice, all right? So even if it's a psychological thing, there are behaviors that you're trying to describe that are a result of these psychological needs. So be sure that you look at all the factors that have to do with the consequences, right? So the FBA book helps you justify the function, helps you get your choice of intervention and replacement behavior. Also, those PowerPoints that I summarized for you help make it possible. So what you're describing in the consequence is not what you're going to intervene in. You are going to be describing what other people or what the environment is doing that is actually causing this to maintain and increase or decrease the behavior, right? Okay, so, but at this point in it, you're going to be at least identifying whether this is what kind of behavior is happening around them, and use those, use that terminology. You can use the positive or negative reinforcement if it's increasing behavior, or you can use positive or negative punishment. That's fine. But when you're talking about your intervention and your replacement behavior, that's going to be a little bit later down the line. All right, so you've done your A, B, and your C. And on the C part, you've got to eliminate socially mediated access functions, or whether it's tangible or whether we have a socially mediated escape type of function based, and the way you know that is based on who's delivering the consequence, right? If it's a person that is delivering the consequences, or the peers are delivering the consequences, meaning they are reinforcing something, then it's likely that it's a socially mediated problem, unless it happens in the environment just naturally. Okay, so let's see, we already talked about the trigger analysis. I don't know why it's in this order. Oh, I know what it is. So let's say you've gone through every one of those things. You've identified what everybody says is the problem. You've described the antecedent. You've described the behavior. You've described how it's been reinforced. But you still can't figure out what exactly is the reason for the behavior. It could be A, B, C, or D. So when you have these behaviors that are very hard to identify, go back and try another trigger analysis. Look for some way to motivate or cause a deprivation condition so that you can force this kind of situation. And then see if you can figure out what the discriminative stimuli is. Is it a particular person that shows up on the scene, and when they show up, then all of the behaviors start to happen? What are the real life scenarios? And looking at what the behaviors are not successful in achieving their goals goes back to the wacky contingency. So if you're observing a family in their natural environment, and the child is doing appropriate things to get what they want, but they're not getting any attention as a result of the appropriateness, then all of that goes into this whole trigger analysis type of thing. You can purposely set up situation where a child is ignored just to see how they're going to handle that. And again, you can go back to the scatter plot if you're needing to reassess it again. You can do the analog assessment, which is a little more detailed, where you decide you're going to have these contrived test conditions in the absence or presence of a human being there, or you may set up a situation in which there's nobody in the room to see what happens, but you're basically trying to mimic all the variables in the environment that could have something to do with a clue as to your function. And we covered this in a previous discussion about when we did test number 2. Be sure that if you're doing it in in situ hypothesis testing. You're going to have to do this this means in the home, right? And so you may have to be a little more creative in terms of how you're going to do your baseline assessment and treatment, what you're going to be expecting the parents to do to help figure this out. And then the ecosystemic assessment means that you're going to really, really look at your wacky contingencies at the very end of this and be sure that there is nothing that keeps changing, that is changing the environment or changing the antecedents that are going on. And so, is there anything that's being reinforced by accident? Is there anything that has to do with the child's inability to handle it? Sometimes changing even the pre-MAC contingency can give you a real eye-opener. So, the child that basically, if they finish, let's say they've been told if you finish your your homework assignment, you'll get to do video games. So the child hurries and does their homework assignment so that they have plenty of time to do their video games, and the parents are like praising them and telling them what a great job they did, and you know what, let's just try 3 more and 3 more and 3 more of these, because just think how happy you'll be when you get this many more tests and you know it better. Well, some kids will fall for that, and other kids will be like, why am I even doing this? Why am I working hard on my homework when my parents are not going to fulfill their promise? And so you get a lot of disappointed kids, and it shows up in terms of their having a lack of motivation and not following through with the plans. And then very lastly on this this discrepancy analysis, this is when you've looked at this whole picture and you say to yourself, you know what, really, this kid isn't that bad. Their behavior is not much more out of the norm than other kids. Why is this kid in particular getting targeted? And being sure that this is not a discrimination issue or some kind of personal bias that's going on that caused them to be reported. Be sure that it's their age and what's being expected of them matches up, because there's a percentage of situations here where you look at the child's limitations, like maybe they have a specific learning issue and they only are having problematic behavior during this particular learning time. How simple would it be to just skip all this behavioral stuff and let's get this kid on target with their academics? And so that's what a discrepancy analysis is basically being sure that you've assessed that this kid can actually do what they're expecting them to do. Previous treatments, this is real important if you're going to be working with parents at all, because if they've been to every professional in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and they've gone to Mayo Clinic or whatever, they've tried all of these psychiatric treatments, they've had this kid on medication or what have you, they're going to be very pessimistic, probably be challenging you, wanting to know why is this functional assessment necessary when Dr. So-and-so and Dr. So-and-so said that this is a problem of, obsessive compulsive disorder, or this is another anxiety disorder or depression. They've given you a DSM-5 definition, but they haven't given you a behavioral definition. And so this is where your own savvy comes in, where you have to listen very carefully to what they've already tried, and then be careful that what you're recommending is not what they've already tried. So if in your mind you're thinking they didn't give it a good enough go or they didn't follow through with the plans, then ask the parents what it is that they think caused these things not to work. And if they think that the reason is because it was wrong, it was just outright and not a good assessment of the child and what's happening, then you've got to go back through your own evaluation and make sure that you didn't miss something. Or it could be that the parents, have kind of set up a no-win situation for you as a professional, and we're going to talk about how to implement at the end of the plan ways to prevent getting into that bind. Of course, you want to be sure that you've reviewed health and medical records for all the kids, and that also means that for your own, again, for your own write-up, make up something, put in there, that you have consulted with the person's, family practitioner, and there's no medical problems that would explain the behavioral issue that this person is dealing with. And then at the very end of this is your hypothesis statement. And so these are examples that I'm giving of a hypothesis. Jack gets into arguments with the teacher every day during reading class when she asks him to correct his mistakes on daily reading workshops, and is protesting an activity when he doesn't want to do it. Okay, that's the hypothesis statement. This is you're basically describing the function, right? So in this case, it could be the functional hypothesis is escape behavior, something he doesn't like. The contextual hypothesis has to do with that when the antecedents and the consequences, basically, what is the teacher doing that's precipitating this kind of behavior, and then how is the inappropriate behavior getting reinforced. And then your curricular hypothesis goes back to what are the types of tasks or instructional demands that may be prompting inappropriate behavior. So in the case of Jack, the problem has to do with his academics. All right, so on this section, these 5 different areas need to be included in your behavioral intervention. But when you're including them, be sure that you are using the terminology that's found in our textbook, as well as the extra readings and the PowerPoints that I gave you. So when you're talking about your event strategies, the setting, you want to talk about, is there anything in the antecedents or the cues or the prompts that start the behavior that you would like to make changes in? So you want to talk about the antecedents that you want to improve upon. So let's say you have a SMA 2 point, let's see here, what do we want? We are going to, let's say we've got a socially mediated access, and we want it to be a tangible reinforcer, okay? All right, so, and this tangible reinforcer is going to be candy. And so what happens is, so very simply, this child that we're working with has been accused of stealing things, okay? And it only happens in Mrs. Jones' class. It only happens with candy that is on her desk. Okay, how simple is it to ask Mrs. Jones to take the candy bowl off of her desk and not have it available, especially during the class where Johnny is there? That completely gets rid of the socially mediated aspect of it, which is Mrs. Jones, and it gets rid of the opportunity, which is another antecedent or the cue, which is the candy bowl on here. Okay, in this case, the instructional interventions might have to do with a different child who has a problem with lengthy tasks or difficult tasks. And so is one of your interventions going to be breaking that down into smaller pieces? And what do you call that? Okay, if you have a direct escape from lengthy tasks, what are your choices that are involved in that? Are you going to use an escape mand to where the child says, this is too difficult for me, can I have a longer time to work on it, or can you break this down into shorter things, helping them come up with it? Or maybe they can't tolerate the full 30 minutes, and so you're asking them to basically delay gratification and hang in there for 5 more minutes than they normally can in order to get a high-powered reinforcer for sticking with that. The consequence intervention may be that you're focusing not on the antecedents and not even on the behavior, but just getting people to quit reinforcing the behavior. So you're basically you're wanting to use extinction. So you're asking people not to do whatever it is that they're doing to help that child escape or to help them get access to something that we don't want access to. And again, you're describing this in the terminology that I've given you. And then when we're working into replacement behaviors, you want to talk about the different methodology of how you're going to implement these different, the analog, remember the analog replacement behavior article? You want to use that and use the PowerPoint to describe how you're going to replace that behavior step by step. And this includes, so this is your paper now for the PMP. So when you were trying to implement these replacement behaviors in your life, what were the problems that you ran into? And was it because you didn't go step by step in terms of implementing this? You jumped from one thing to another. And so were you capable? Was the student capable? Is there a skill deficit? Is there, something that has to do with the natural environment that made it difficult for you to implement this scenario? So number 5 is when you're basically trying to implement things into the key routines of the family. And sometimes when you're implementing this, you see that the key routine has to do with the antecedents or the consequences, other problematic behaviors. Now, the third thing that goes along with this section of behavioral interventions is trying to anticipate what can go wrong. And so, for instance, your therapist or someone could get sick and miss an appointment. And what are you going to do? And I'm speaking about myself. What are you going to do when your reinforcer, your human reinforcer, is not there to help and support you throughout your plan? Or what if you do have vacation? What if you are on, on a very strict diet, and this whole Christmas time and Thanksgiving and other holidays that have to do with different religions come, and you have eating that goes along with that, and you're not allowed to eat it? Did you anticipate in your behavioral plan what was going to be your way of preventing problems? They talk about, like in Weight Watchers, going out to eat. Before you go out to eat something healthy at home so your appetite is lower. So they're basically trying to get rid of your establishing operation and make it already abolished by the time that you go out to eat, so you don't order something and gorge yourself. And then last, or not lastly, but your section 4 goes along with monitoring and evaluation behaviors. So these are how you're going to set up exactly what I had you set up. So, you went through, you had a couple of baselines, right, which is up there in the functional behavioral assessment. But then I gave you an opportunity to try your implement your plan for a week. And I don't remember anybody, but I think 1 out of the 7 of you were able to implement that plan, and it worked. And so then you were back to square one again, trying to figure out, was my function wrong? Or my consequences not strong enough? And so the same thing goes with your final paper, or if you're working with a family. You may come up with a fabulous plan, but if everything goes wrong, you're going to have to reevaluate this on a regular basis. So I would recommend building into your plan that every 2 weeks or every week, for the first 4 weeks, you're going to be available for follow-up with teachers, with daycare center, with the parents, to be sure that it's working. Then you can try your 30-day chart in which they're working on it on their own, and try to then sit down with them and evaluate what were the problems during the 30 days that caused things to happen. Even people getting sick, mom getting sick with the flu is going to interfere with a plan to help a child get potty trained. And then what you want to write up what do you think should be done differently if you have to redo the project. So you're basically doing a first write-up, which is your functional behavioral assessment and your behavioral plan, but then you want to do follow-up reports that have to do with the success or your confidence in the success of this plan and building in those opportunities to check and make sure it's working. And so that's one of the things that you need to build into your paper is a description of how things went wrong, how things went right, what would you do different, what would you recommend for the future as if this was something you wanted to continue into next semester, okay? So you want to describe how you would continue to evaluate and graph your plan. And if your plan didn't work at all, then you need to go back and reevaluate your function. That's usually the first thing you want to do. Your function is probably wrong, or you picked an intervention that actually didn't fit the function. Otherwise, it's kind of a guarantee if you follow through all of the steps that you will find success if you get the function right and you get the behavior. And lastly, I wanted to give you a few websites that I thought were pretty good that had some help with terminology. Also gives you some idea of how other ABA people handle situations, their write-ups, and wherever you work, they're going to have their own forms. But that's why I want you to have an opportunity to do a format in which everything is in the format that I gave you, so that there won't be any difficulty or surprises if you're working in an ABA site or you're doing a behavioral plan in general, whether it's through kind of counseling conditions with your own self, with your own family, with friends, children that that you're recommending things to. Be sure you understand how this all interplays for your final project, okay?